He was, to all intents and purposes, what you would call a throwaway kid. He was born in Kentucky in 1934 to Kathleen Maddox, who was a 16-year-old tearaway from a Christian, very strict Christian background. She was young, she was wild, she obviously had a young baby in tow, and he was a hindrance. So he was passed initially from relatives. Then, as he grew up, he became more and more, I don't know, agitated against society, and he found himself within state institutions, young offenders. I mean, he worked his way. He was on the bottom rung of being a career criminal from a very early age. It's a predictable route for many young kids from a disadvantaged background, but I think it becomes interesting when he found himself incarcerated in Terminal Island Prison in 1962 on facing a 10-year stretch, and it's within that time that he began to look at himself and immersing himself in esoteric doctrine. So, and then of course released into the Summer of Love in 1967, things took an interesting turn, to say the least.
The world that he was released into in 67 was so different to the world that he had gone into jail in. It was a completely different country. We know the changes that took place in the 60s, and he arrived in San Francisco and that whole Summer of Love. But I really want to know how it was, what you got out of talking to people who knew him and reading about him. Where did this incredible charisma come from? Because it just seemed as though he would meet somebody, he would talk to them, he would say the right thing, they would drop everything and follow him. Now, many of them dropped very little, but they were just strays, they were runaways, they were throwaways, they were kids like he was. They were 16, 17, 18-year-olds, the same age perhaps as his mother. Maybe he saw that in them. What did he have? What was he saying to them?
There's many levels to this, and I think one, which I looked at quite closely, that he did study a lot of doctrines in prison, a lot of them to do with mind control. He also looked at Scientology. He looked at Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People. He went on a course for that in prison. He was interested in how he could control people. I think that's fairly evident. Obviously, though, he had no inkling that he was going to be released in March 1967 at this dawn of this age of Aquarius, of the hippie dream and explosion. And he gravitated towards San Francisco. Now, he was slightly older than those kids. Most of those kids in Haight-Ashbury at the time were sort of either teenagers or early 20s. But he had wisdom, and he had this collateral of being in jail, which he promoted. We also have to look at the mindset of young people at that age, that we're very impressed by people in our teenagers who are in their early 30s, and especially with a criminal background. He also was a musician, and he wrote quite extraordinary songs for the time. And he imbued these songs with many of the doctrines which he'd studied. So he was a bit of a package. He had quite a charismatic presence on many levels. Ultimately, I think a lot of that came from his instinct that, obviously working his way through the prison system as a child himself, he realized what he could get from people by saying the right thing at the right time to the right person. And he was very, very clever and instinctive. So yes, I think he had a natural charisma, but I think he knew what he was up to. And I think he knew exactly. We've got to remember the people he attracted were teenagers and early 20s. Most people of his age literally wanted nothing to do with him. And I think that's the interesting thing. Yes, he was charismatic, but he really appealed to a certain generation. If you look at the Manson family, no one really over the age of 25.
But those women especially, and some men, but mostly women that were attracted to him, they were from middle-class upbringings. They were intelligent women. One was a librarian. The first woman that joined him, Mary Brunner, was a very intelligent woman who was at university, who had been to university. These were not your throwaways in a way. They found themselves on the streets, but they were, for the most part, intelligent, educated women.
That's right. And I mean, I think Manson had this ability, though, to detect weaknesses, and I think if they're, especially with girls with, as we say, strange relationships with their fathers or undetermined relationships with their fathers, and he was able to fill that void. He was also able to give them answers, and again, looking at the mindset of young persons of that age, you're looking for answers, and here was a person who was giving the answers. He also detected that, we're going back in time here, but obviously a lot of these people came from strong religious backgrounds, and he was able, very charismatically, to share his own presumed divinity And he would incorporate a few, shall we say, magical acts to make them feel that they'd seen something spectacular or fantastic. And he was a very attractive personality. And I think looking at the mindset of these young people, it's something in that psyche at that age which is looking for answers in a black and white world, and he was able to find. I mean, whatever they wanted, whatever they needed, he was able to find that, or to respond to that and say, well, I've got the answers to that. He had an answer to everyone. At this point, at the early, it was a loving commune. It was although he was very much the patriarch of the family. The talk was not of murder and violence. It was of love and peace and music. And it was, from the researchers and the people I've spoken to, it was a very happy and joyous group. I was talking to some people in San Francisco who put together a magazine on the culture, and they chose the Manson family as a blueprint for community living. And they went down and stayed there, and they said, yeah, I liken it to like Little House on the Prairie or the Partridge Family. It was a very, very happy unit. And this is difficult to talk about because obviously, as we said earlier, Manson has become the prime metaphor for evil and horror, and the early days was joyous, and that's what kept them going. That's what these girls had seen, nothing like this, and he provided all of that.
But you said he knew what he was up to. Now, perhaps
I think, yes,
in getting these girls, and because girls drew boys to the commune,
yeah,
and hopefully that drew money, which is basically what he was about. But do you think he knew what was going to happen, or was it a case that at some stage he quite literally went mad?
Yeah, and it's a timeline to this. Basically, one thing that is determined in Manson's largely undetermined world is that he did want to be a rock star. He was obsessed with the Beatles. He'd seen them in prison in 1964 when they came to America, and he'd witnessed and trailed their enormous influence. And he felt he aligned himself with them, a working class kid coming from Kentucky, disadvantaged. He thought that with his talent for music, that he could garner the same sort of interest. So he really wanted that. And he pulled a few people in along the way, sharing that belief that he thought he could actually manifest some good music. But this was underpinning his whole life. And I think the family at this time were also believing that he was going to be a major rock star. That dream fell down quite spectacularly in 1969. And a lot of other things happened as well, which really rocked his dominion within the so-called family. So the events that happened on August 8th and 9, looking at them very closely, we're seeing a timeline of collapse of every atom of Manson's world, which he built up, and his devotees were believing in this, that was going to happen. It collapsed quite spectacularly, leading to this crazy horror. But as I found out researching this, that Manson had actually cleared off at some point. He was so disappointed with what had gone on. He cleared off, and he arrived back on the day that the night manifested the Tate slaughter. He wasn't there for the week before. So if he was planning it, certainly wasn't there. I think he went crazy. Yes, I do agree with you. And I think on that night, a lot of things happened, which, in a sense, the helter-skelter theory, which he'd been going on heavy frequency, was the last weapon in his armory. The music career had gone. People were leaving the family. There'd been a drug deal that had gone wrong, and someone had been murdered. He thought he'd murdered a Black Panther. And then the final straw, when he arrived back, that two of the girls were arrested for stolen credit cards. And that's when he decided, he said, now is the time for Helter Skelter. So I think he went crazy. And I think it was a result of what happened within his community, which he'd propped up with his musical career, and it wasn't happening.
Simon Wells is my guest, the author of Coming Down Fast, and it's the biography of Charles